It's late December 2025, and the timing alone tells a story. Just days before Christmas, images appear that millions were never supposed to see. Carefully framed holiday moments revealing Archie and Lilibet in full view after years of deliberate absence. The photos spread instantly, not because they are rare, but because they collide head-on with a promise Prince Harry has repeated for nearly a decade, that his children would never be pulled into the spotlight that consumed his own childhood. That contradiction is the spark, but it is not the fire. The fire comes from London, where Angela Levin, a biographer with unusually intimate access to Harry's inner world, is once again speaking, and this time her words land with far greater force. Levin is not a casual observer reacting to social media posts. She is someone who walked palace corridors with Harry, sat across from him in private rooms, and listened while he spoke about grief, fear, and the legacy of a mother he believes was destroyed by exposure. When she suggests that Harry no longer controls decisions about his own children, she is not guessing at his values. She is measuring current actions against years of clearly stated convictions. That is why these claims resonate, and why so many royal watchers feel something fundamental has shifted. According to Levin, the issue is not a single photograph or a festive card. It is a pattern that has quietly emerged, one where Meghan's projects, branding moments, and public messaging repeatedly override Harry's long-standing position on privacy. Each appearance of the children may look harmless in isolation, but together they form a narrative that directly opposes the rationale Harry used to leave Britain, fracture his family ties, and fight expensive legal battles over security. The same man who testified under oath about credible threats is now appearing in imagery released to millions worldwide, and that inconsistency demands explanation. What makes this moment especially volatile is the imbalance implied beneath the surface. Levin's commentary points toward a household dynamic where objections are muted, compromises are one-sided, and decisions move forward regardless of Harry's discomfort. Observers note his body language, his tightened expressions, his absence from promotional enthusiasm, all standing in contrast to Meghan's confident presentation. Whether one sees this as strategy or coincidence, the visual message is unmistakable. One partner drives the narrative, the other follows reluctantly. This is not about villainizing or sanctifying either figure. It is about recognizing the emotional cost of contradiction. Harry built his post-royal identity on the idea of protection, safety, and control over his family's exposure. Watching that foundation erode in real time forces an uncomfortable question. If the values that justified everything he gave up are no longer being honored, what exactly remains holding it all together? And as cameras flash and commentary grows louder, the silence from Harry himself becomes the most revealing detail of all, suggesting not peace, but a man still calculating the personal cost of speaking when consequences finally arrive publicly. To understand why Angela Levin's comments are landing differently this time, you have to rewind to the promises that defined Harry's public identity long before California, Netflix contracts, or lifestyle brands. He spoke about privacy not as a preference, but as a line in the sand, a boundary drawn in response to childhood trauma and the relentless pursuit that followed his mother until her final moments. Those words were not casual. They were repeated in interviews, court filings, and speeches, reinforcing the idea that protecting future children was non-negotiable. That stance became the moral justification for everything that followed afterward. So when Levin now points to photos, videos, and carefully timed releases, she is not inventing a conflict. She is highlighting a rupture between belief and behavior. The children appear when there is something to sell, something to promote, or something to soften public perception, and that is precisely the scenario Harry once described as unacceptable. It reframes every smiling holiday image into a question rather than a celebration. Why now? Who benefits? And who is quietly swallowing objections to keep the peace? Levin's implication is that the answers point in one direction, and few want to say it aloud. This framing is deliberate because it invites the audience to feel they are discovering the truth themselves. Rather than shouting accusations, the narrative lays out a timeline and lets repetition do the work. March becomes July, July becomes November, November slides into December, and suddenly coincidence looks like strategy. Each appearance of Archie and Lilibet feels less accidental and more transactional. The viewer is nudged to conclude that these moments are decisions, not slips, and once that conclusion settles, sympathy shifts decisively toward Harry. He is framed as someone watching his own red lines erased in real time on camera. Levin's credibility functions as the emotional backbone of this story, and the script leans on it heavily. Her year with Harry is referenced repeatedly to remind viewers that this is not armchair analysis. Access becomes authority, and authority becomes permission to speculate with confidence. Even when claims are softened with words like allegedly or sources say, the underlying message feels firm. That confidence is contagious, pulling the audience into alignment with her perspective. By the time doubts arise, emotional investment has already taken hold. Skepticism fades behind the momentum of a story that feels earned through familiarity and repetition alone. What ultimately separates this narrative from ordinary gossip is its psychological framing. Harry is not portrayed as weak, but as conflicted, caught between protecting his children and preserving his family. That tension is relatable, and relatability is the engine of engagement. Viewers are encouraged to imagine themselves in the same impossible position. Would you speak out and risk collapse, or stay silent and slowly erode inside? That question lingers long after the details blur together. It transforms celebrity news into a cautionary tale about compromise and control, and that is why this story refuses to fade quietly from public view.
At the center of this unfolding drama is contrast, and contrast is what keeps audiences locked in. On one side stands Harry's documented history, years of statements, legal actions, and emotional testimony that frame him as a man haunted by exposure and determined to end the cycle. On the other side stands a present reality filled with polished visuals, brand-aligned storytelling, and children appearing at moments of maximum visibility. The friction between those two realities is the engine of the narrative, and it grows louder with every carefully curated release. What makes this contrast so potent is that it does not rely on new revelations alone. It relies on memory. Viewers are reminded again and again of what Harry said before, what he promised, what he sacrificed. Each reminder functions like a benchmark, making the present feel like a deviation rather than an evolution. This is subtle but powerful persuasion. Instead of arguing that someone is wrong, the story suggests they have been betrayed by their own past words. The audience fills in the judgment themselves. The script also leans heavily on isolation as a theme. Harry is depicted as increasingly alone, physically distant from his family of origin, and emotionally outnumbered within his own household. References to advisors gone quiet, relatives estranged, and even supportive figures stepping away all reinforce the idea that resistance has become exhausting. Isolation explains silence. It frames inaction not as agreement, but as fatigue. For viewers, this reframing transforms frustration into sympathy, which is far more effective at sustaining engagement. Meanwhile, Meghan's role is framed through action rather than diagnosis. The narrative avoids clinical labels while repeatedly emphasizing outcomes. Photos are posted, brands are launched, projects move forward. children appear. The absence of overt explanation becomes its own explanation. Intent is inferred through repetition, not accusation. This approach shields the storyteller while sharpening the implication. It feels observational, even when it is deeply critical. Another key technique at work is escalation without resolution. Each segment raises the stakes slightly higher. First it is a photo, then a campaign, then a pattern, then questions about schooling, culture, and identity. By the time speculation reaches potential separation or rupture, the audience has been primed to accept it as logical rather than extreme. The story does not rush to a conclusion. It circles it, hinting, pausing, and pulling back just enough to keep curiosity alive. Ultimately, this section of the narrative asks viewers to consider not what is happening publicly, but what it costs privately. It suggests that the most damaging conflicts are not the loud ones, but the quiet compromises that accumulate until they hollow something out from the inside. And by framing Harry's silence as evidence rather than absence, the story turns restraint into its most compelling proof. That implication lingers with the viewer, creating anticipation, reinforcing loyalty, and encouraging continued attention. Because unresolved tension feels more truthful than neat answers, especially when real lives, power, and identity remain visibly unsettled for everyone watching closely.
The reason this story grips so many people is because it mirrors a familiar arc, one where intention and outcome drift apart until the distance becomes impossible to ignore. Harry's fight for security was never abstract. It was detailed, legalistic, and emotionally raw. He described threats, fear, and the weight of history pressing down on his choices. That history is now contrasted with glossy imagery that suggests normalcy, generosity, even warmth. Children helping at food banks, smiling on bridges, framed as symbols of wholesome purpose. On the surface, it looks benevolent. Underneath, it quietly undermines the narrative that justified extraordinary demands for protection. This is where the script subtly invites viewers to become analysts rather than spectators. It asks them to hold two ideas at once and notice that they cannot coexist comfortably. If the danger is real and ongoing, exposure makes little sense. If exposure is safe and acceptable, the danger becomes harder to defend in court and public opinion. The contradiction does not require conspiracy to feel unsettling. It requires only attention, and attention is exactly what this storytelling style rewards. Another layer driving engagement is the suggestion of inevitability. The audience is guided to believe that moments like this are not isolated missteps, but checkpoints on a longer road. Each public appearance is framed as making the next one easier, normalizing what was once unthinkable. This gradual shift is portrayed as more damaging than an abrupt reversal, because it happens quietly, without declaration, while previous statements remain on record, unchanged and unrescinded. The emotional weight intensifies through visual interpretation. Body language, facial tension, and posture are treated as unfiltered truth. Words can be managed, statements delayed, but images feel immediate. By emphasizing Harry's perceived discomfort and Meghan's visible confidence, the narrative reinforces a power imbalance without needing explicit claims. The viewer is encouraged to trust their own eyes, a persuasive tactic because it transforms opinion into observation. Crucially, the story never claims certainty about private conversations. Instead, it leans on probability. What would have to be true for these outcomes to keep happening? Who benefits? Who absorbs the cost? And who appears to have adjusted while someone else has not? This framing allows speculation to feel reasonable rather than reckless, grounded in sequence rather than rumor. By this point, the audience is not just consuming information, they are anticipating consequence. The question is no longer whether something is wrong, but when it will surface openly. That anticipation keeps viewers invested beyond the current clip, waiting for confirmation, denial, or rupture. It transforms commentary into serialized tension, where silence itself becomes the cliffhanger, and every new image is scanned not for joy, but for cracks. This final sense of waiting is intentional because unresolved stories travel further, invite debate, and pull audiences back repeatedly, searching for validation of instincts already formed, convinced that the next development will finally force truth into daylight. That moment feels closer now, even if no one knows how loud it will be. The moment finally arrives. What happens next matters less than what has already been revealed through contrast and repetition. This story has never depended on a single insider or one disputed claim. It rests on alignment, or the lack of it, between words spoken with conviction and actions repeated without explanation. That gap is where audiences linger because it feels human, uncomfortable, and unresolved. What elevates this narrative above ordinary celebrity coverage is its moral framing. Viewers are not simply asked to choose sides, they are asked to weigh principles: privacy versus publicity, protection versus promotion, sacrifice versus outcome. These are not abstract debates. They are anchored to a man who made irreversible choices in public and now appears unable to steer the consequences privately. Whether that perception is entirely fair almost becomes secondary to how convincingly it is constructed. The script's strength lies in restraint at the end. There is no dramatic declaration, no definitive verdict. Instead, the story slows, allowing the audience to sit with the implications. If Harry truly believes what he has said for years, then silence becomes painful. If he no longer believes it, then explanation becomes necessary. Either path demands reckoning. Avoidance only deepens the tension because the pattern has already been noticed. This is why Angela Levin's voice continues to echo, even when she is not speaking directly. She represents continuity, a living archive of Harry's stated values. Her presence keeps the past active in the present, preventing reinvention without accountability. Each time new imagery appears, it is measured against her recollections, her writings, and her insistence that this man once knew exactly what he wanted for his children. As the calendar turns and speculation builds, the audience is left with a final, lingering image, not of smiling children or polished holiday cards, but of a man standing between the life he rejected and the life he now questions. The tragedy, if there is one, is not public exposure itself. It is the erosion of agency, the sense that decisions are happening around him rather than through him. And that is where this story ultimately lands. Not in certainty, but in recognition. Recognition that power dynamics shift quietly. Recognition that ideals are easy to declare and hard to defend. Recognition that sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what is said, but what is allowed to continue. Whether Harry ever speaks openly, draws a line, or accepts the new reality, the audience has already drawn its own conclusions. They will keep watching, not for scandal, but for resolution, because once a contradiction is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and it demands an ending. This closing tension is deliberate, carefully engineered to outlast the video itself, ensuring discussion, debate, and return views long after the final frame fades to black for viewers everywhere. That unresolved pull is the currency of modern commentary, and it is precisely what keeps audiences emotionally invested and waiting for answers that may never arrive but still feel necessary.